Bonjour, merci. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organisers of the conference for inviting me. I was a mere graduate student when Metropolis, British Columbia, first started. It was then known as RIM. And I'd like to say that 15 years later, I've been incredibly grateful to be part of the Metropolis institution. So I'm very grateful for that. Okay, my PowerPoint slides don't appear to be here. Oh, yes, they are. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about immigration-trade nexus in a comparative project looking at India-Canada relations and India-Australia relations. Okay, top one. Recently, the popular and academic press has examined the role immigrants play in enhancing international trade, suggesting that countries hosting large immigrant populations might benefit from their cultural and economic competencies in a globally competitive and interconnected economy. In this representation, I will discuss research that examined this trade-immigration nexus comparatively in the case of Australian and Canadian relations with India. So I'll just go through the outline very quickly. I'm going to talk about the research, the question, and I'm going to point on some findings. More details can be seen in a short report on the project in the Diverse Communities Programme booklet in your conference bag. So, economists who have attempted to quantify the relationship between immigration and trade have found that constructing universal statements about the relationship difficult, due in part to the complexity and diversity of the processes and geographies involved. As Canadian economists Head, Rees and Wagner, writing in 1998, conclude, determining how immigration and trade are linked proves elusive, yet there continues to be strong evidence that the link is there, end quote. Understandably, the processes involved depend on trade theories that recognise the significance of imperfect competition. For example, John Halliwell, writing in 1997 on border effects, emphasised the importance of institutions ranging from the family to firms to national organisations that help facilitate trade and overcome these border effects. This view certainly resonates with the work on transnational immigrant entrepreneurs. In terms of understanding the immigration-trade nexus, we have somewhat greater success using the work of social scientists who focused on how socio-cultural relations inform economic exchange. Bourdieu's work on social and cultural capital has been influential in a range of subsequent work examining how the socio-cultural informs the economic domain. Geographically, work on immigrant transnationalism has examined how these networks are formed by immigrants whose daily practices span national borders on a regular basis. The immigrant entrepreneur's ability to negotiate the new global economy is also seen in the work on flexible, trust-based networks and the highly influential work of Annalise Saxenian on new Argonauts. She argued that immigrants working in Silicon Valley's high-tech sector who created regional advantage by expanding Silicon Valley's manufacturing and developing networks to complementary sectors overseas, including India, Taiwan, China and Israel. And finally, this has informed the focus on transnational entrepreneurs, or TEs, as many business commentators now comment on. So, if the literature indicates the power of immigrants to develop trade, then this leads me to my research question. Why is it that two countries, Australia and Canada, with similar population sizes, resource-based economies and active immigration policies are diverging in terms of export trade with India? And how can we contextualise this by understanding the role of transnational immigrant communities? Arguments that the existence of a positive relationship between trade and immigration exists are perplexing in the case of Canada. We have a large Indian immigrant population, but a constrained trade-in relationship with India relative to other nations such as Australia. During the early to mid-2000s, for example, Canada lagged the growth of exports to India when compared to other industrial nations. For example, while Australia moved up from India's 11th importer in 1998-90 to 8th in 2008-2009, Canada dropped from 26th to 28th position over the same period. Canada-India trade relations in the past have been hampered by irritants, including Canada's extended nuclear sanctions in the 70s and the 90s, and ongoing tension over Sikh Khalistani separatists and Sri Lankan terrorist groups, arguably based in Canada. Economic geography obviously plays a role, but even so, the degree of divergence in the trade relations is still perplexing. One way to explore this is to think more deeply about the nature of Indian immigration in each nation. Indian immigration is more spatially concentrated in Canada compared to Australia. Over half of all Indian immigrants in Canada reside in Ontario, compared to 1/3 in Australia's main reception state of New South Wales. This is certainly suggestive of stronger network migration. Canada also has a longer history of Indian immigration, with a larger cohort of second and subsequent generations. For example, immigrants represent 46% of Indian ethnic origin population in Canada, compared to 62% in Australia. Immigration composition is also different. Australia's immigration has been more heavily skewed towards economic class. For example, in 2005, family class represented 24% and skilled 73% of South Asian immigrants to Australia, compared to Canada's 40% and 57%. The regional origin of immigrants from India is also different, though this can only be inferred from other proxies such as language and religion. In the case of Australia, the higher percentage of Indian-born Christians and Catholics suggests greater emphasis on the south of India, compared to Canada's larger share of Sikhs, which is indicative of stronger ties with northern India, especially Punjab. With these differences in mind, then, this research drew on qualitative interviews with 60 respondents, 30 in Vancouver, British Columbia, 30 in Sydney, Australia, to gather comparative assessments. The samples were fairly similar across the two regions and included the education sector, which is a growing area. The findings of the research, as I said, are detailed more fully in a short article in Our Diverse Cities. One of the clearest differences between the Canadian and Australian samples is what I have termed regional disadvantage. This highlights its contradictoriness to Saxenian's argument about regional advantage. Interview respondents in British Columbia linked this discourse to the regional history of Indian immigration to Canada, which has traditionally comprised Sikhs from rural Punjab. In British Columbia, the dominance of immigrants from Punjab was seen as skewing any efforts to build trade relations with India, of which the following quote is illustrative. Now, Punjab only knows Punjab, and that is the problem. This discourse functions to spatially essentialise Indian immigrant ethnicity within both the Indian and the Canadian context, since the inference is that Indians from northern India were unable to conduct trade with southern India, which was seen as the more vibrant economy in the region. The next most notable difference between the two samples emerged around perceived policy contradictions between the need to monitor and manage borders through closure and control on the one hand, and the need to keep borders open to skills, capital, goods and services in order to be globally competitive. This has been termed the liberal paradox. This liberal paradox emerged clearly in the Canadian case in relation to difficulties some respondents reported in securing visas for business travellers and Indian students. Half of the Canadian sample ranked this problem either as first or second in importance, as one commentator lamented. When I was in India, they were talking about problems with visas. They used the analogy of the difference between Canada and Australia, saying that if there were 10 applicants for a visa in Canada, Canada would deny 9 and consider 1, while Australia would open up 15.